You're like,
Good morning.
Hey, everybody.
It's Thursday. This is Table Talk. Welcome.
Welcome.
There you go. There's your intro.
Right. We're coming off of a lively discussion as we open up Table Talk. Or lively pre-discussion.
It was partially lively, partially deadly.
I was trying to be a little bit sarcastic.
Yeah.
Talking about preparing a will
Yeah.
before my surgery, so that's
talking
fine.
Talking about Brent getting his stuff in order.
Yeah, not that we think anything bad's going to
Not
happen,
that
but
anything bad's
it's
going to happen.
just the responsible thing to do. So
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Do you want to let people know when your surgery is?
it is.
Since we're on the topic.
Cinco de Mayo. That's how I remember it right now. Yeah, May 5th, and
I thought you were talking about the
5:30 in the morning, which isn't
On the
great,
box.
but yeah. So a couple weeks away. Yeah.
So keep that in prayer.
Thank you.
It's coming.
Yep.
So,
May the 6th it's a Star Wars thing, Revenge of the Sith. So there's
Mhm.
Revenge of the 6th. May the 5th and Revenge of the 6th.
May the 4th be with you is
And
also
May the
Star
4th
Wars
be with
thing.
you, yeah.
They're taking everything from us. In the future, there won't be Christian holidays. It'll just be Star Wars holidays.
do you have a shirt that says that?
I don't, but I might be down with that.
May the
I know
5th
you
be
would.
with you.
I figured you had it, dude.
No,
Yeah, doesn't Disney do a big thing on like May
They do.
4th?
I probably do. I try to leave my Star Wars shirts for kind of wear around the house, not necessarily
That's good.
always out in public.
Gotcha. Don't want to cause someone to stumble.
Or lose respect for
Right.
you.
I try to keep my nerdiness somewhat concealed
your
as
Jar
much as
Jar
possible.
shirts.
That's good. We appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly for you guys.
What else is new? Any announcements we need to make or anything like that? I don't think there's anything crazy coming up, right?
Free food market is tomorrow in La Pine
That's right.
at 1:45.
That one's at 12.
No, that one's at noon. Yeah.
They are two different ones. I think we confused people this week. So the one that takes place here in Sun River is they don't drop boxes like prepackaged boxes in your car. They are boxes filled with groceries, but they're two different things. So I know that sounded like I just made it more confusing probably,
Yeah.
but they are different. They're both Neighbor Impact sponsored. They're just slightly different. So
But you get food at both of them, right?
you do.
For
The other
free,
ones,
right?
the other ones,
For free, yeah.
they are, yeah, one's a box filled with dairy and it's always kind of the same type of thing. You get like meat, produce, dairy. It's all in one box and they just drop in your car. Perishable stuff. This one is
where's
more,
that at?
that's the one in La Pine.
Okay.
This one's more groceries that they didn't sell in time and are about to go
Yeah.
bad. That they, but they aren't bad yet. They bring them and, so it's all kinds of different things. You never know what you're going to get.
They had a ton too.
Yeah.
I stopped in and they didn't have as many people show up as usual on Monday, and they had a ton of food.
So yeah, and they're both drive-throughs, but they're slightly different and at different times. So
Gotcha.
talk to Diane Smith if I've confused you completely. She'll get you straightened out.
Or just
Yeah.
show up on Friday
Yeah.
and you get what you get.
I put an old slide up from like early COVID times this Sunday, so then that confused everybody even more.
I wasn't trying to call you out, but that's exactly what happened. It's Jordan's fault.
That's true.
So I don't know of anything else to announce.
Yeah. I don't either.
Covered
Cool.
all the important stuff there.
We're gonna move on then.
All right.
We're moving into our topic. This week's topic
Quick
is
for us.
Yeah, unusually early.
we're still talking about the church.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we've kind of alluded to this because, a lot of these things dovetail and blend together. But today we'll more just focus on the idea of what this is, and that is church planting. And if you've been at the door for a while, you've heard us use that phrase a lot. It may even seem like we're really excited about that phrase, and it's because we are.
Yeah.
What is church planting, or what do we mean? Because I've actually had people say that when we're in a discussion. I mentioned church planting. There's times people look at me and they're like, "What do you mean when you say that?" And I just always assumed like the phrase itself is self-explanatory. Like when you plant something, you're
As
starting
opposed to, like
something.
starting a church or something like that.
yeah. So what do we mean when we talk about church planting? Or yeah,
I
what is
like the idea of it as, taking a seed, where there is nothing, putting it in the ground and starting to watch it grow
And then
into
there's
something.
something.
Yeah.
So as opposed to like, a lot of times you just see people move from church to church, or
Right.
a church rescue might be a little different. A church plant is where there's nothing there and you're coming in to start something, get something new going.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so which is what we did almost 10 years ago.
There you go.
At the door, there was nothing kind of focused on the area we're in. Churches nearby, but not really targeting this area. So we saw a field that had no real church presence and thought, let's plant a church there.
Yeah. So what the door is today is a result of a church plant where there was once nothing, and then we came and started something, stuck something in the ground, and it grew. So why is church planting important? Why does it matter? Why should we be doing it? Actually, let's start with this. Why in the world, which we've done before, does the church exist on earth primarily?
Let's make disciples.
There you go.
Preach the gospel.
There you go. So it's not, because a lot of times I think, again, people, I don't know what they think, but I think their idea of once they get saved is, okay, now, I'm here to come together and to grow in knowledge, which is true, and to read my Bible and go to Bible studies and to sing songs with other believers and to pray with other believers and to serve other believers. And that's all the one another's that go on and the stuff inside the church. But the truth is we're going to be doing every single one of those things better for eternity in heaven. Those aren't things that are exclusive to here. There is something that is exclusive to the church on earth that we won't be doing there. And that's, expanding God's kingdom to his glory, right? Which is primarily done through church planting. So yeah, the importance of church planting it's the Great Commission. I mean, we're actually being obedient to what God has left us here to do when we're doing that. So, and of course, we see this throughout the Bible. We see it throughout the book of Acts. That's primarily how the kingdom started pushing out and growing and taking, enemy territory so quick. It just spread through, mostly guys like Paul, going through different regions and starting something, and then it ends up popping up and whatnot. So
It could be I don't know if you're going to go there, but it could be a more effective way of actually reaching people.
we are going to go
Okay.
there. Yeah, and that's,
Okay.
I'm glad you're thinking that way. So we're definitely going to get into all that. So
I think it's Piper that talks about that the mission exists because worship doesn't.
Yeah.
In one of his books, and the idea is that because there are people throughout the world that don't yet worship God, that to your point, we have a mission that has an end date to it,
yeah,
and a limited time to this mission while we're here on earth, to promote the worship of God and to call people to faith in Christ.
yeah,
And that's going to be over one day, but the worship of God will exist into eternity, and that's never going to come to an end.
Yeah.
And because that's true, it makes the mission that we have all the more important because of the eternal ramifications, for lack of a better word.
yeah.
Of that.
Yeah, there's a dude named Cahill that I wouldn't promote his stuff. Some of his theology is really bad and whatnot, even though I'm promoting it right now. But he has a book called One Thing You Can't Do in Heaven, and that's what the whole book is. And it's actually the way that he hits it home is pretty cool.
Yeah.
You kind of walk away from the book going like, gosh, this is a bigger deal than I ever thought it was, and then the church, I think, promotes it to be. So it's a big deal. So let's switch gears slightly. When a local congregation starts to get a little bit fat, what are their options?
2 services.
It's
Two churches
that's
in
definitely
one
one of their options. Because we've been here too, right? I mean, we've been here at the door in this local congregation. So like when you get to a point where you start kind of filling out the space that you're in, there's a dilemma that arises, and then there's options that are laid out.
Got
So
a campaign.
what are they?
Got a campaign for a bigger building, man. You got to get a thermometer
Right.
out.
Build it up.
You got to make this. You got to bust open the walls and build bigger barns.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Years ago, I had a conversation with a pastor up in the Portland area who they planted a church, and their intentional strategy before they planted the church was to say that when the church grows to a certain size, I think it was 200 if I remember right,
Okay.
that or 300, that they would send 100 people out to another part of Portland. And so their target was to keep the church, around 200 to 300 people, and then intentional. And he asked the question, like, what do you think would be more effective, having one large church of 2,000 people, or having 10 churches of 200 people strategically placed, in Portland? And certainly our context is different than the city, but I just always thought that was kind of a cool. That they were intentional about, we're going to get to a certain size and then send people out over there.
Sure.
And
So
that does
they
seem cool.
they had a ceiling, like a number
Right.
cap, which always cracks me up too, because there are churches that are like that. Like this is the ideal
Right.
size of a church. Once it goes beyond that, it's no longer a good church. It's a bad church, and of course that's silly too.
But we did definitely see that that dynamic take place when we first started, and we were probably 50 people and knew everybody. It was a very tight knit group. grew to about 80 people. It still kind of maintained that. And then when we hit, 100, 120 and kept going, it did change the dynamic of things a lot,
Yeah.
where you didn't know people as well. People could be gone for a while and you didn't notice it. It was not as personal, not as intimate. So smaller in a lot of ways was.
Well, to your point, we hear that too.
We do.
We've had people
Yeah.
that were here from the beginning or here through those years that are no longer here. And one of the reasons they're not here is because they're disgruntled. They're saying this isn't what it used to be. And usually 9 times out of 10 what they mean by that, whether they're able to identify it or not, is that it was smaller, simpler, more intimate, more unified, more like it was just because of its size.
Right.
Right.
And there's also been good things that have happened with more people coming as well. We've seen, we have opportunities to do more things for the community, more things together.
Sure.
There's it's not like it's all bad, but it definitely changes the dynamic.
It does.
And I think when you would get to a church of the size you were talking about, of, a couple thousand people, at that point it almost becomes, I don't know. That's why everybody in town, when you ask them what church they go to, they always mention the same one, because it's so big that nobody knows if you go there or don't.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Literally, you'll ask,
Yeah.
oh, who do you know there? Oh,
Yeah.
nobody. What's the pastor's name? I have no idea.
Where do you go?
You know?
I go to that, that big one on the west
Yeah.
side. They don't even know the name of
Yeah,
it. And it's
right.
like, no one's gonna argue with you. Like
Yeah. And
no
that's
one's
not
gonna
meant
know
to
you
pick
don't.
on West Side, but it's like it's so big that it's, of course I go to that church because you can't prove I don't.
Yep. Exactly.
Years ago, I had this series of chiropractors. Like I was going to the chiropractor for a time, for probably about 3 months, kind of every week, and I would end up in this back room. Like after my treatment, then they would hook these electrodes to me, and like there were like 3 or 4 people usually in this back room getting their stimulation or whatever it was, and there was this guy that would be in there, and we started talking because we'd be there the same time every week. And one week he asked me, like, do you go to church? And I said, yeah, I go to church. And he's like, oh, what church do you go to? And I told him what church. And he's like, well, I go to that church. I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen you there before. He's like, yeah, I go there. Like, well, I'm one of the pastors there. And like, it wasn't a big church at all. He's like, yeah, I totally go to that church. And I don't think he went to that church. So it happens in small churches
I
too.
told you about that chick a couple months ago. We were talking, and she said she went to the door.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, really? Yeah, I'm a pastor there. I've never, met you before. And she's like, well, I go to the other one. And it's like, well, I can go to the other one too. So yeah, it's pretty
Sometimes
funny.
it doesn't matter.
It's like you picked the wrong church.
No, not the church part of the door, the other part.
Yeah.
I had
awesome.
an interesting thing come up on my social media feed the other day that somebody was asking a question about how big is too big for a church.
Yeah.
And there were several answers, but one guy answered the church is too big when the pastors don't know everybody, or pastor or pastors, depending on your model, don't know everybody and can't be known by everybody. And that was just kind of thought provoking.
Yeah.
I've been kind of chewing on that for a couple of days.
So we were too big at 50 then. For me, I mean, not for you.
Doesn't mean you don't know their. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying. It is kind of different in our dynamic because with 2 locations and rotating,
Right.
you don't always,
Sure.
know everybody to the same extent.
Sure.
But I think everybody that goes here has the opportunity to know one of the pastors
Sure.
and be connected.
Yeah.
We're accessible to people.
Yeah.
I hope.
Right.
It is that way in La Pine right now.
Yeah.
Because we're averaging around 40 a week right now.
Right.
Plus we do meals afterward.
Yep.
And I feel right now extremely comfortable with knowing all those people there, and just beyond their names, but like knowing them and them knowing me.
Right.
And having that mutual access to each other and relationship to each other. It feels right. It feels manageable and doable. But if it gets much bigger, it's going to be.
I feel the same way at 3R, but I'm better.
You're way better at it.
People's names.
You're way better at it. I'm constantly nudging you, right? Like, who is that? Like I've met that person 20 times, but can you tell me what their name is? And
Sometimes I
Where
think
they're from.
I am the church director.
You are,
because I get texts all the time. Do you know this phone number? Do you know that? Yeah, I do.
That's awesome. So again, when churches grow to the point that they're faced with a growth dilemma, the options are, you already mentioned a couple of them. What are the typical options? Just to lay them out again.
2 services.
Multiple
bigger
services. What are you kind of doing when you do multiple
Kind of
services?
creating like 2 different congregations in a way.
Building a
in
church on top of
In
a church.
fact,
I don't think
the church
anybody
I
thinks
grew
of it
up
that way,
in,
but it is true.
they definitely don't. But like the church I grew up in, you had like the traditional service at 8, which my dad always wanted to go to,
Yeah.
and then the like
Contemporary,
contemporary
yeah.
one at 9:30 and
Yeah.
11, which we always wanted to go to.
Yeah.
and then we'd never get up, and he'd wait for us, and then he'd miss church and be
So
upset.
you had the owls, the service for the owls, and then the service for the millennials.
It's,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's like, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I just think that's such a bad idea, biblically speaking, to try
It's
to
horrible.
separate. You're separating the
Yeah.
young people from the old people.
Well, we talked about
Doesn't-
this with integration a few weeks ago.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You know, why, and again, it doesn't fall out completely that way because some of the older people want to go to the contemporary service and so forth, but you want everybody to be together. You want the kids,
Yeah, right.
you know, you want all the church
You're
to be
unintentionally
together.
creating a divide that doesn't need to be there.
Right, and typically you are going to create two churches, even though some of the parts and pieces are the same. You know,
Sure.
the leadership might be the same. And you're also creating this weird. It's a lot more work, you know, to try to do it twice in a row because now you've got to everything you've done once, you have to probably do twice. You know, as far as
Yeah.
worship and all these things. So
which
it's
means
just
your staff
it's a much
and your
bigger-
volunteers
yeah,
have to do
much
twice.
bigger machine to
Right.
try to keep moving.
Yeah.
And if you do like traditional and contemporary, you're kind of catering to people a little bit, which like isn't
Right.
always bad, but can get
You're
kind of
feeding
carried
the
away.
consumerism.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I don't know. I don't want to go the contemporary one. I want to go the old hymns or whatever. And it's kind of like, I don't know. It's not always wrong, but it can become a problem, especially if you're dividing
Right.
really one congregation into two.
Yeah. Why
So-
would you ultimately go to bat for two services? Why would you actually go through with adding multiple services rather than?
It's still a way to
Sufficient.
it's still a way to connect, you know, more people to the gospel. And you know, you own the building already. You're already paying you know, you don't have to take on a new lease.
Right.
You don't have to. So there are some practical
There's some
things.
efficiencies to it.
We've gone over the pluses and minuses.
Sure.
You know, it wouldn't be the end of the world if we ever had to do that.
Sure.
Because if
It's
we
not the
haven't-
unpardonable sin.
if we
but
have
it's
not,
close.
if we haven't tapped the potential, you know, if we haven't reached this area the way we want to, and there's still all these people out there that need to be
For
reached,
sure.
and there's a way to do that by creating a second service or a third service,
Sure.
or a different day of the week, you're still reaching people for the gospel. Now,
Sure, yeah.
you have to be realistic though about what you're doing. You are creating a second church
Yeah.
to some degree.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't
You're
get away
kind
from
of
that.
planting
Yeah.
a church in your church.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you could do like a Sunday evening service or Saturday or something, and if you could reach different people. I know my dad's church in Utah. They started like a Sunday evening service as an outreach to the Mormon people because they're already at church
Oh.
in the morning. And they tend to be kind of pious and would attend maybe another church, and that worked to some degree. But like that kind of made sense to me. It was like, okay, you could never really come on Sunday morning because you're at this other church, but we want to, preach the gospel to you. So if you'll come on Sunday evening, like let's
Yeah.
do it. So that made sense.
It's
Yeah.
still one church with two congregations. I mean, kind of like what we're
Yeah.
doing now. We have
Yeah.
one church with two congregations.
Sure.
We're doing that. It's the same thing if you do multiple services, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Is there another option? Like if you're trying to truly exhaust a specific region for the gospel and you feel like there's more that you haven't tapped it, and yet wherever it is you're meeting is exhausted, like there's no more room. What is there another option other than in that location building another church or service on top of it?
Yeah, plant a church.
But I mean, where? I guess
High
what?
school, like wherever you want. When
Sure.
You,
Yeah.
Well,
home
like
groups, stuff like that.
these guys in this book that we've been looking at, which is it Total Church or Everyday? I always get them mixed up. We've shown
Total
it to you.
church. Yeah, total church.
So they're big on house churches.
Yeah.
And so I think in that context, that's one of the things they have going for their house church model is that you can saturate a local area or a local region with 10, 15 of those bad boys and homes, and it makes sense because you've got neighborhoods, you've got sections and sectors
Right.
within that region. We're in a building. I think that would be better than a building because in a building you are actually losing things by trying to maintain a location of a large population, right? And so I think that's where they're coming from in that area, and it makes sense if you're actually
Right.
planting in homes. If we believe that
Yeah.
our home groups, like we often talk about them as being small church hubs, actually being the church when they gather, then it makes a lot of sense as far as saturating an area, truly saturating an area.
Well,
with
and,
church
and
growth.
ideally, it shouldn't be either or. It should be both.
Yeah, sure.
and,
Right.
Because I think there are people that won't walk into a home.
So we're going to talk about that
Yeah.
too,
but-
and
but
you're
they won't walk
absolutely
into a
right.
church. So to me, it's like, let's
Yeah.
just, let's do both.
Right.
Yeah.
We can't reach the people.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think we often bring our kind of Western entrepreneurialism into the church. We've talked about this before, I think, through this series, but we're trying to build a brand
Yeah.
often of our church, and assuming that people have noble reasons for that. To your point of the more people that can hear the message, great. Oftentimes we're trying to build an organization, and again, often with noble intentions of trying to get more people to come and to hear the message, and we're trying to do so as efficiently as we can, trying to be a good steward of our resources. But the biblical way isn't always the most efficient way.
Right.
Like it would have been easy for us, instead of starting Lapine up to say everybody come up to Sun River. It's just a few miles down the road.
Right.
That would have been more efficient. We've already got a building.
Right.
We're going to be less expenses involved in that, and would be better, for the limited resources that we have. But like I said, the biblical way isn't always the most efficient way.
Agreed. Totally agree. So one of our options when you come to the dilemma, when a local congregation comes to a point where they're busting at the seams, is to add services, basically. Another one is to build a bigger facility or add on to make the space bigger to accommodate more people. What are the pros and cons to that?
I have a con that's kind of maybe not funny, but like
I already laughed. And I
in
don't even know what it is.
Minnesota, in the city, there was a church there that was growing right in like the 70s and was becoming big, and I think they had like maybe 300 people, and they were like, man, we're expanding, like things are going really well. So they built this sanctuary to house like 700 people, and it was just like, it's really ugly actually. It's just like a big box. The ceiling's like 60 feet high, like it's really ugly. Anyway, they built this big building, and like they peaked, dude, and like after that it just started going downhill. So it was like, then by the time we actually planted a church in that building, which was weird. And then there was like a Somalian Christian group. There were like multiple churches planting in this sort of like ancient structure by that time. It was kind of funny to me, but like, I don't know, one is just, you don't know the future. So building a big, piece of property sometimes doesn't go the way you think it's going to go. Maybe that,
Right.
God has blessed your church with a lot of people coming and in community and stuff like that, but maybe the answer isn't always going bigger.
Sure.
So that's kind of a weird con.
Sure. And it's hard to know because it's not like down the line like this, but is that even the best use of the congregation's money
Yeah.
when it comes to church growth? Because we're really talking about church growth here. I mean, it's really synonymous. When we're talking about the mission of church planning and going into areas, we're also talking about church growth, which is why we're saying when local congregations get so big, what do you do? Because it's a church growth issue.
Yeah.
And so you have an option to take the gospel and push it out maybe into a place where it hasn't been, or to continue to, gather it to where you're at, make it come to you.
Let me throw down one more con.
Yeah.
When you have a building and you're like, okay, we're getting big, we need to expand, we're going to build a bigger building, like that often, almost inevitably becomes the mission, right? It becomes the mission of the church, is to like get this building built. Doesn't always like totally destroy the church or like totally distract everybody, but it really, even without like a temperature thermometer gauge and everything, it often becomes like our mission is to get this building built, often for the future generations and everything. And then you have the building, and just maintaining some of these like behemoth real estate things and just the management of a building almost takes another board. You have a committee and everything. It can be really distracting from the mission we're called to, and I've seen that in a lot of churches.
Totally agree. And they talk about that here. He says, like on page 86, over time, churches seem to acquire committees, meetings, programs, traditions, none of which may be wrong in and of themselves, but which cumulatively,
You did it right.
I'm trying to get enough syllables in there, move the church from mission to maintenance mode.
Yeah.
And so before you know it, you've been hijacked from actually outward gospel work to maintaining and trying to keep up with the machine, like you mentioned earlier, that which we've created.
Right.
It's almost like a trellis and a vine thing, even.
Yeah.
Where all you're worried about now is building and maintaining the biggest, most beautiful trellis you can,
Right.
rather than worrying about the vine.
Well, and it is hard. Even right now with our building, we've got some things we have to do. We have to focus on getting a sprinkler system put in here in 3R and some other things. And it's just, it's part of the deal. And it is, it's very easy. We've never tried to let the building become the focal point. It's pretty obvious if you come in here and look around. Right. I don't mean that, but I mean, we don't, it's not our, but there's some things you just have to do. So it is a distraction. And I'm going to try not to say this in a way that steps on any toes. so I'm trying to be careful the way I say this. But you can look at the impact when we got sent out from CBC, very low impact to send us out. You know, they I think gave us $1,000 a month for the first year roughly, and that's that. You know, to plant cost them very little. It did cost them some people that they didn't maybe want to lose.
Well, it only cost them a couple families out of a couple hundred, probably.
Right, and I mean they were really good families. I'm just kidding.
They were
Choice, they were. But to see the impact that's been made, you know, as opposed to trying to like, you know, triple the size of that
Yep.
building or do, you know, they could have done other things as well. But to see it now, you've got a church
the
that's,
payout.
that's similar in
Yep.
size and scope and over a short period of time. I mean, that's pretty amazing to
Yeah.
think about, even being so close to them.
Yep.
We're barely, you know, a mile apart from each other and a huge impact
Yep.
at very little
Yeah.
cost.
So having said that, that segues perfectly. When our options are basically add services, build a bigger facility, or plant out, split off, right? Why do most churches typically go with option up instead of option out?
I was talking with a pastor friend of mine years ago about that very thing.
Yep.
And small church in a small town, the church was busting at the seams, and so that was the conversation: is, you know, up or out. And the hesitation in planting another church in this same small town was that they didn't want to be perceived as competition, and it just was kind of this wrong mindset of like, there shouldn't be competition in the church. Like,
Right.
we should gladly plant more churches and want to see more churches, even if it's across the street,
Sure.
rather than, you know, having to go to the next town down so that you don't, you know, impede on what the original church is doing. And, you know, the CBC thing was before my time here, but that's just cool that they were willing to support, you know, a church plant just down the road,
A mile away.
rather than saying, nah, that's going to be too much competition for
A mile
us.
away, but 1,000 miles away.
Right.
Well, I think they also knew that they recognized that they weren't able to reach people they thought we would be able to reach, and that's exactly kind of what's happened. We're very different in the type of folks that come in and what it, you know, what it resonates.
And that's the 1,000 miles away part.
And that's not always, you know, that thinking isn't always present, and so that's cool that it was present.
Well, and that's partly why we didn't want to go to Lapine for, you know, we saw a need in Lapine and we had a heart for Lapine, but we didn't want to go down there and plant church number 30 or whatever
Yeah.
it is, you know, and come across as like, well, you know, we're here to compete with everybody else.
Yeah.
But when we had the opportunity to combine forces with somebody that already had something in that location, it really changed.
Yeah.
You know, that to us was a no-brainer at that point. It's like, okay, that's fair game. And we've been received very well for the most part, I
Yeah,
think,
right.
by everybody down there, which was really a relief and a cool thing too. So, not that we've competed with
Sure.
other churches down there either, but
So that
Yeah.
runs us into the next question, like, where should a church plant go and why?
Yeah.
Like, should it just not care about where it's going? Should it just go somewhere because it likes the location or it likes the demographic? Those are the kind of people they want to fill their church with. Should it be somewhat strategic where you plant a church? I mean,
Yeah,
if you
you
have a
wanna-
garden, it's the same way.
Right.
You're not gonna, take a tree that's already existing and stick your new seed underneath that tree or right next. Like, it needs room, it needs space.
you want to find the really the up and coming affluent area in the
That's
city
right.
Young
where you've
families.
got the young
Right.
families
Where's the money?
and the money and
Right.
that's
Money.
where- that's
And the hipsters.
We've actually,
and the money.
we've actually had people that we, you know, over the years that have come, we're planning a band. Oh, where are you going? And they would say that exact thing without,
Yeah.
you know, the mockery.
Yeah.
But it was like, oh, you're gonna go where, you know, it's just weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our philosophy's always been find a dark spot on the map where there is no real church present.
Find a place with no shade.
You know, find a place that's obviously broken with people that need a lot of help right now and that aren't maybe getting it and go and pour into that area.
Yeah.
And those aren't typically the appealing places.
Agreed.
You
The
know.
appealing ones are already taken.
Those are the kind of places that are not on anybody
That's
else's
true,
radar,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. So in light of everything we're saying, what about Lapine? Because you already mentioned it, like, we're looking at the spot and we have a heart for it and we're thinking that there's gospel work that needs to be done, but there's already 25 Protestant churches in this little community with a small population of the community going to churches. So none of those, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, it looks like it's oversaturated and exhausted. So why would we look at a place like that and go, this makes sense still? So if it's not because of a lack of, it's not necessarily a dark spot, or is there another way that an area can be a dark spot?
There's probably not a lack of churches in Lapine, but there is a lack of churched people in
Okay.
Lapine. And you know, Lapine's not, there's a lack of church people everywhere.
Sure.
But there's broken people that need hope of the gospel, and not to be offensive to anyone, but like I think part of what we're doing in La Pine, there's not a lot of other churches doing what we're doing, and I don't say that to lift us up or to pat us on the back.
That's actually what I'm looking for.
We have a theology and a methodology that comes from that theology that we just don't see in other churches.
There you go.
And again, I don't want to say that we're better than anybody else or anything like that, but
I think you're actually saying Jesus is better than
Right.
everything else that's being put out there.
And there's definitely some churches in La Pine that are preaching the gospel.
There are.
And so it's not like it's devoid of that, but I would say that there's definitely more of a need for that there.
Yeah.
And so to come in and kind of combine or partner with some of the churches that are already doing that,
Yeah.
and a lot of those churches are small.
Thanks
They're-
for cleaning up that
No,
for me.
that's all right.
and clarifying.
No, I totally agree with you. There's churches that are small. They're 20, 30
Yeah.
people, and there's still a lot of folks in that area that
Mhm.
aren't going to any churches. And so to again, we're not coming in and saying, you guys are all doing it wrong. We're doing it right.
Right.
But we are very much focused on the person and the work of Christ, and not enough churches are that way today. And so,
Exactly.
so you can't really overdo that.
Yeah.
And a church that is about that is going to be happy that we're next to them,
Right.
swinging with them.
There's also like a phenomenon, I don't know if we're going to get into this, where like even doing a new work in an area or planting a new church in an area, even if there's an established gospel preaching church that's been there for a long time, like CBC or something, it's like just having something new creates kind of a vacuum where different, unique things happen.
Dude.
Are you going to get
Did
into
you
this?
did you just read my next?
No, I can't read that.
Dude, there's some serious synergism going on today.
Well, it's what's exciting
just
about
rolling.
Imagine that.
church plants is
We're just
God
rolling.
does new things in it,
So what? That's my very next question. Oh wait, yeah,
but
go
real
ahead.
quick though, the other thing that's cool to think about is when the community sees CBC is always Coeur d'Alene Bible Church, Community Bible Church, Sun River, and The Door, two churches in the same area that aren't fighting with each other, that aren't competing against each other, that are actually
Yeah.
rooting for each other
Yeah.
and doing so. That's a huge testimony
Yeah.
to
Absolutely.
the gospel.
Yeah.
And so that's a beautiful thing to see churches coming together. We're seeing some of that same camaraderie in La Pine.
Yeah.
Amazing to see. We almost did a joint service with another
Right.
church down there. The community needs to see more of that. It
Yeah.
almost looks like we're divided and we hate each other and we're fighting against each other
Exactly.
too often.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yep.
One of the things, like when we first started La Pine, that we kind of touted out to the community was that often churches split, and it's not often that you see churches come together. And like one of the things that we were excited about is to see a couple of churches come
A
together,
marriage rather than a divorce.
right? Because it just
Yeah.
sadly doesn't always happen.
even if a lot of those people ended up leaving anyway.
Yes.
Sorry. Don't
Yes.
don't even don't mention that. Sorry. Yeah.
All right, back to where Jordan went, because that's where we need to go now.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true. It's one of the most, this is part of the reason I love church planting so much. And if you've ever been a part of a church plant, you know what we're talking about. What are some of the things that you may be more apt to find or experience in a church plant as opposed to an already established church?
And you see like unchurched and non-churched people, which sound like the same thing. Unchurched to me is like went to church and don't go to church anymore. Non-church like
Yeah.
never went to church. I don't know.
So
I might have-
church, you might say.
I might have made those
Strong
up.
boycott
Yeah.
and soft boycott.
Yes. But you see people who, because it's new, right? Because they can come in when the church is new, and maybe there's not all these established traditions or expectations. They'll come in non-believers. It's like kind of it's a weird phenomenon to me where they'll come in and they'll sit there week after week. I mean, we had people. I remember there was a young man coming to La Pine for a while, and he was coming every week, and I was like, what, like. I met with him, took him out to lunch. I was like, hey, like, do you believe? Like, have you heard the gospel? Like, all these things. He's like, no, I don't know. It's kind of personal. Like, it became clear in my conversation with him, like, he doesn't really believe, but he's there every week. And I just thought, this is, like, weird. Like, in a cool way. Like, this dude's hearing the gospel every week. Like, I hope that, God wakes him up. But, yeah, that's just one of the phenomena. You see people who don't belong or would never really be seen in an established church come into the church and hear the gospel.
That was what the door looked like when we planted.
Well,
And
even
it
when
didn't
we,
even make sense.
when we went to La Pine,
It doesn't make sense.
you saw the same thing happen when La Pine kind of formed
Yeah.
into this new thing. You saw an excitement. You saw people that never did anything
Right.
in this location show up there ready to work, rolling up their sleeves saying,
Yeah.
how can I be a part of this? Now they had an opportunity to do something where here they didn't feel like they did.
Yeah.
And that may or may not have been the case, but all of a sudden they had a spring in their step.
Sure.
They were excited. There's just, it generates this level of,
You saw people move from the fringe to the
Yeah.
center.
I felt that.
Yeah.
way a little
Absolutely.
bit. I got to do a little more.
yeah. Which again, it's
Yeah.
just, every time you do that, that's going to happen again and
Yeah.
again and again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, it creates a need for people to serve, which is kind of what you're saying. Like, and it's cool to see that in the core group meetings, and then as we started the church, it's like we need someone like for childcare. We need people doing this. It's just cool.
It is. I think
And I
one
think-
of the, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I think something that you see in the church plant often is that it kind of fights against this consumeristic mentality
Yeah,
that the
for
church
sure.
exists for me.
For sure.
And it hopefully we want to kind of build into the DNA of the church is that the church exists for those who have yet to be a part of it, at least
Yes.
in part.
Mhm.
And so it kind of gets this focus off of I'm going to come every week and I'm going to fill my tank to where
Yeah.
I'm going to be a participant and serve so that others who are not yet part of this can become part of it.
For sure.
You kind of get like a year honeymoon period where like no one complains about the color of the curtains. Once that year's up, though,
Yeah.
well, that's the other part
Right,
is that, a new plan is nimble. It adapts easily. It's just, you can do what you need to do pretty easily.
Yeah.
Whereas an old established church, there's so much, just to make a simple decision, it's like a giant
Yeah.
ship with a rudder this big, you're
Yeah.
trying to just, takes forever to make anything move or turn or decide something.
Yeah.
And a church plant doesn't have that, which you love obviously, because,
I do.
you can
Yeah.
literally, you don't have to really think about things too much. You just follow God's
Yeah.
lead and try to run as fast as you can behind him, and keep up.
So I think the
Yeah.
fact that it's new and there's not something that's already established allows for that spontaneity. In fact, you have to rely on it, as well as dependence, like both those things. And I love both those things. And I think that's actually why God works in such a unique way in church plants, is because we haven't come in and locked it down. We haven't come in and made it ours. To the point to where God's outside the door,
Yeah.
knocking. And so, and I think somehow even non-believers know that in a new work. They know that they're coming in at ground zero, even if they don't buy into the whole religiosity of it. They actually want a front row seat
Right.
because they know that that it's something that the DNA is being built rather than already been built, and they get to be a part of that.
Right.
We had that
Yeah.
here, where our first core group meetings, when we sat in my living room to, discuss what this was going to be, had a few non-believers in there, some from my neighborhood that never went to church. One of them was just clearly not a non-believer, and it was like, oh, you're starting a church? I'm there. I have to be there. And it's like, why? Like, that doesn't
Yeah.
even make any sense. And they were part of that, and he ended up, of course, getting saved, and we baptized him and stuff. But
First convert, first baptism, first one to go home and be with Jesus. You had
Yeah.
to be the first at everything.
Yeah.
that guy.
you got
Wow.
to be the first at
There you
everything.
go. Yeah.
But there is something that I think people collectively understand about our new work, and that is that it's new. And the possibilities are maybe endless. They're intriguing even of what that of being a part of something new,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, I think the statistics will say that church planting is one of the most evangelistically
It is.
effective.
Yep.
It's one of the most effective ways to reach people.
Yep.
For all those reasons.
Yeah.
People are more willing to come check that out.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it, which I kind of mentioned, is the dependence is the other side of it, because you can't predict what's going to happen, and it hasn't been like fully established. Like there's not this formula that works, and so you just go with the formula. There's more of a dependence on the Lord. There's more.
Yeah.
There's more leaning. There's more pressing in. There's more desperation for God to do something, because you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or next Sunday, or and I just think God honors that in big ways, and we've seen it time and time again.
Well, and one of the important things that we need to do as leaders and make sure that our people are kind of aware of this is how passionate we are about this, and that we plan to do this over and over
Right.
again. Because if you're not prepared for that, it's hard. Because
Yeah.
now all of a sudden you're seeing maybe a pastor that you enjoy walking away for a time, or people that you enjoy, moving
Sure.
off to
Yep.
the other places. And that's a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that we need to understand why we're making, and that it's important to make.
Sure.
And that it is going to be just part of our DNA.
Yeah.
And so if you're new to the door, or you're wondering, what makes us tick, this is going to be something we continue to do over and over again.
So this is beautiful. This has just flowed the whole time. We've all been just, which is my final question: when is it time to plant again? And I know we've kind of spoken to this, but maybe I'm thinking a little more broad. like when is it time to plant? Because it doesn't only need to be when a church is busting at the seams. Like there could be other components or nudges, you know. So
This is a hard one to
Yeah.
answer because
Yeah, I
I
know.
think we had that desire from day one when we started the first location.
we're gonna do this
Um,
again.
You know, that was something we talked about. We were excited. When will it be? You know,
Mhm.
and it took way longer. We even took one run at it, and it didn't work out.
Right.
We talked about it. We tried many avenues, many doors, and it just didn't work out as quickly as we thought. So we thought it probably would happen within the first 3 or 4 years, maybe, and it took longer than that. And so ultimately, it comes down to waiting on the Lord,
Yeah.
and waiting on the leadership, because I think you have to
Yeah.
have His blessing and His, and you also have to have the right people in
Yeah.
place to do it.
Yeah.
And those aren't. There's no.
Yeah.
You can set goals and stuff, but those have to be in place.
They do.
It's tough because sometimes you look at it and you go, okay, like a lot of churches are like, okay, do we have the resources to do it, like
Mhm.
financially, leadership, and things like that. And I think it's good to consider that, but also sometimes, like just by the act of doing that, stretches the church into a place where people rise up in leadership
Sure.
and the resources come with it. So it's kind of hard to like gauge that sometimes.
But I think with both of those, like we can always be looking for opportunities. Like I
Yep.
don't think we need to sit,
Mhm.
sit on our hands,
For
you
sure.
know, until a certain time comes or whatever. But that we can always be kind of on the hunt for opportunities, and even I think we can be strategic and even look down the road and say, well, we would hope to do this over here at a certain time. Ultimately, it's all these things that you guys have mentioned, come into play. But we can be as strategic as we can be while we wait on the Lord to provide resources and opportunities to do
Yeah, be
things.
preparing
And it-
people, be preparing leaders.
Yeah.
And I would say we're not committed to making just doors everywhere. You
Correct.
know, we don't have to. The next one might not be a door. It may not involve us for very long. The idea that we would just continue to rotate between 5 locations isn't practical. It's
Right.
not reasonable. It's not. It ain't going to work very well. And
Yeah.
even between 2 has been kind of tricky.
Yeah.
And so we don't know what it's going to look like. We're kind of open to that idea. But the idea of raising up new. We still believe in co-leadership. So you have to raise up more than one guy, and to be able to spread them out. But it could look totally different.
That's a really good point, because we're not. I mean, it's good to distinguish for everybody that we're not just about putting our name everywhere.
Right.
We're pro church plant, not
Yep.
just pro door. So, and again, we were talking about it before. I am a part of a church planting network. I work with church planters from all over the world every week, and it's because I'm pro Great Commission. I'm pro the gospel of Jesus going out to the nations, and so I'm always working with guys that are planting other churches. They have nothing to do with the door. We've met locally with other guys who maybe we can partner with resource-wise, prayer-wise, care-wise, maybe even with our gifts for a time, that would probably not be a door in areas around Central Oregon. So we're pro-church plant,
Right.
not pro-door necessarily. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we definitely believe in some of the characteristics and the distinctives we've built. We have a conviction there, but we're pro-gospel above our distinctions, right?
Yep.
So, okay. That's all I got, man. It just went,
I got one more thing.
yeah,
So
finish.
maybe add something a little bit. Is like, what's interesting about the conversation is like, I think when I was younger, when I first heard about church planting, it was like this risky thing you would do with the hopes that someday this other church would kind of look like our church.
Yeah.
Like it would be stable and good leadership and a building and all these things was like the goal.
So
And
that's the
it's
measure of
clear
success?
from our conversation. Yeah, it's like. No, like the magic is
Yeah.
in that, in that beginning. Not that it's like, okay, it means
Right.
nothing later, but like there's a purpose and a mission to those first couple of years, that's special. And I think some churches may never look like, I don't know that Lapine will ever look like 3R as far as like,
No, I won't.
the
And that's not
building
necessarily
and
the
kind of
goal.
the like everything. No, and it's not the goal. And I think that's important.
But the
for
feel
people
is the same.
to
If somebody went to either service, it would feel somewhat the same as far as what we do and how we do
Yeah.
it and what we focus on.
As far as the
Yeah.
brand or the flavor or whatever, like it feels
Yeah.
very much the same. But even the people we're getting in, it's funny because there's 12 miles between us or
Right.
15 miles between us. Even the demographic is different. Even though there's
Yeah.
some similarities, it's a different animal. And therefore the church is going to develop and form differently because of the people that are, making up the DNA.
Right. Well, and we've talked about in the past that, like if we were to plant another church, if it's going to be called a door, then there's kind of certain characteristics that we would want that to take on. But if we were to, partner with somebody else and help plant a church that isn't necessarily a door, then we wouldn't impose, necessarily those same
Distinctive,
characteristics.
whatever, yeah.
To your point, that at the end of the day, we're pro-gospel, pro-gospel-centered churches, and whether we plant a door or help somebody else that's planting a non-door, that if the gospel is the main thing, then
We're
we're
on.
going to eagerly get behind it.
That's right.
Yeah.
For
The
sure.
other really cool thing that just is about church planting is
Mhm.
you don't have to have hardly anything to get it going.
You don't.
And I think that there's a real misunderstanding about that idea that
Yeah.
if you build it, they will come. You have to build this great facility, have everything in place, have your lights ready, your sound
Right.
ready.
Well, most church plants are built off budget first,
right.
rather than
Yeah.
desire first.
You can start in a
Right.
living room with 10 people and watch it grow to 20 and then move from there, and it just let it organically kind of grow and
Yep.
form into
Yeah.
something. And that's exactly what we did. It was kind of amazing how every piece and part that we needed, the Lord supplied at the right
Mhm.
time.
Yeah.
And it grew at a very
Sure.
it grew pretty quickly, honestly, but it was all manageable. And when we needed something, it showed up, and it wasn't like I think it just doesn't have to be complicated.
Well,
I guess is the point.
to your point, I think it's easy for a church plant to live within its means
Yeah.
at whatever stage that is in the church plant. But we haven't thought that way corporately. We think corporately when you go to start
Right.
something,
We
and
think
it's
entrepreneurial.
working from the top down.
Yeah.
But church plants, biblically, they work from the bottom up, and they live within their means. So they function within their means. They minister
Yeah.
within their means. You just do what you can do, and God picks up the slack. But why do we have a problem thinking that
Well,
way?
even
Is it just because it doesn't look sexy when it starts, or
Well,
Even
and it can be
paid-
messy.
Yeah, it is messy. Even
Yeah.
paid staff
Hard to
wasn't
control.
necessarily. You have people that we both work regular jobs and just volunteer our time while it got going, and then over time that's changed. But it's pretty doable.
It's
And
extremely
to
doable.
have a group of 20 or 30 people meeting, pretty amazing right now that
Yeah.
that's not taking place and could be,
Yeah.
and we can be a part of that. We're excited about it.
I think of our friend Pastor Jeremy up in Madras that they're coming up on 3 years of the gathering at Madras, and so that's
Mhm.
something I've been involved in before we came to be part of the door. And they didn't lead with budget. There was a small group that just they prayed for 6 months to a year and met together before they decided what God's calling us to Madras. Not even to plant a church initially. It was we're called to Madras to go make disciples. And so a group of people moved to Madras. They said, I don't know what this is going to look like. It is the same thing. But they didn't go with this grand idea of, we're going to have a budget and a building.
And a cool
we're gonna-
logo.
Cool logo and
Yeah.
marketing and attract the masses. They just moved
Yeah.
to Madras. So we're just going to go infiltrate the community. We're going to live and
Yeah.
work in the community. And what they led with ultimately was relationship.
Mhm.
And out of being relational and starting in a living room, they eventually got to a point where it's like we have a church now, and relationship is part of the DNA of their church.
Yeah.
And almost 3 years into it this summer, like it shows that relationship is a value of theirs,
Yeah.
and that's what God has used to grow that church. And it's not fast.
Yeah.
It's a bit messy
Yeah.
because of just being involved in one another's lives, but God is growing a church there, and it's cool to see.
Yeah, and they actually hit that in that chapter there, right? They hit gospel and community. Again,
Yeah.
those seem to be the two words that they use over and over again
Mhm.
as far as why plant a church. And those are the two things that does it. It's the gospel, obviously, that brings people in, but it's also that communal aspect where these are people actually doing life together and
Right.
knowing each other, which ends up gluing them together underneath.
And the experts might say, don't do it that way.
Right. No.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? I know there's a ton we could talk about, but that was kind of
Yeah, it's good.
enough. So, very good. Let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for what you've done here. Thank you so much for planting this church in this area, God, the people that have come to know you, that wouldn't have known you otherwise. It's just awesome that you use these means, that you use us, that you use church planting to spread your glory and the glory of your Son throughout the earth, God. And I pray that we would continue to be excited about it, willing to do it. And we thank you that ultimately this is how your church is going to grow into its fullness, God, is just by spreading and spreading and spreading wider and wider, farther and farther until it's complete, until you come for your bride. And so we thank you for the bride of Christ. We thank you for allowing us to participate in that and be a part of that, God. And we thank you for your love that you have for her. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah.
And next week we'll bring another exciting episode.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. We should have